If I'm not ready, we're in trouble, aren't I? So, yes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your attendance. Today's speaker is Dr. Alex Bump. Alex received his bachelor's degree in physics from Williams College and PhD in structural geology from University of Arizona. He currently works at the Gulf Coast Carbon Center here at BEG. Alex has 20 plus years of experience in petroleum exploration and carbon capture and storage. He currently focuses on development and application of tools to quickly and efficiently high-grade and de-risk CO2 storage sites. So whenever you're ready, please start, Alex.
Thank you, Noor. Much appreciated. And thank you all for coming today. Those of you in person, which is always fun, and those of you online who I will trust are there, even though I can't see you. For those online, I will roam around a little bit, so I will sort of appear on camera and off camera. Sorry. But the real story, of course, is what's on the screen. And let me start by acknowledging my co-authors. As you see, there's quite a team. Sahar, Hailun, Sue, Yulia, Dallas, Saad, and Tip. And this is one of those fantastic collaborations where everyone brings something unique. And the sum is so much greater than the whole is so much greater than the sum of the parts. So that said, let's talk about composite confining systems. And most of us come to CCS from the world of oil. I certainly did. And if we don't come from the world of oil, then we have heard of the world of oil, and we carry some of the thinking from oil and gas. And we know clearly that geology or geologic systems can retain buoyant fluids for geologic time. Oil and gas experience proves that. We have also a lot of experience with CCS. So to date, the history of CCS starts in 1972. And to date, we have a wide variety of projects completed, some ongoing, and many, many more in development. But that history gives us a certain track record, right? And you can see the map of projects here as of 2020. Most of these are completed, a few ongoing, but they're scattered all over the world, large and small, different geologic settings. There's a lot of experience here, all of them successful, but they all have one thing in common. Every one of them has used a petroleum type of reservoir and seal, right? A good, clean sand or carbonate and a thick regional marine shale or evaporite, right? The same sort of thing you'd see in petroleum exploration. However, CCS is not petroleum, as I like to say. We are injecting industrial quantities on decadal timescales, not accumulating geologic volumes over millions of years. The rate is fundamentally different. And we need retention for millennia, not tens to hundreds of millions of years. Right? And in practice, if we retain it for millennia, it's not going anywhere. But our statutory requirement and our climate requirement is millennia. Critically, our goal is sequestration, not production, right? Injected CO2 does not need to remain concentrated or mobile or large volume recoverable. It's more secure if it's none of those. And that actually opens the door to asking, what do we really need for confinement? Could CCS be different from petroleum? The regulations on this are not prescriptive. US law says a confining zone capable of impeding the flow of CO2 and displaced brines. It does not say regional seal. So proving other systems would unlock new acreage, and I'll show you in a second. Might even offer greater security for sequestration. So this is motivated by our own local geology. We have an awful lot of storage projects moving forward on the Gulf Coast, driven by proven geology and emissions. This is a cross-section showing you that coastal geology. It runs from just the east side of Houston, basically out through Trinity Bay and onto the shelf. And you see prograding deltaic sediments, lots and lots of sands and shales. The window for storing CO2, the pressure window from top of supercritical CO2 down to the top of overpressure, is the gray area, right? And there's, of course, lots of injectable sands within that. Also, two marine shales, classic petroleum seals. The Amph B up in the shallow section and the Anahuac shale is the deeper one. but they do what marine shales do, right? They thin and they pinch out up dip, which leaves an awful lot of really tasty looking sands uncovered by a regional seal. So what do? Do you abandon those? Can't inject there, sorry. Or do you come up with something else? Is there another way? And there are, I have to say, an awful lot of producing petroleum fields outside of the coverage of those marine shale seals. Clearly, it can work. And this is where I introduce the concept of composite confining systems, which we define as a multi-layered system of discontinuous barriers with no a priori requirements for either continuity or capillary entry pressure. The idea is that in aggregate, they create a long tortuous flow path for vertical migration that just spreads CO2 horizontally and attenuates the mobile fraction through what is basically migration loss, dissolution, pore throat trapping, local capillary trapping, distributed buoyant traps, and it reduces the column height, right? So it reduces the driving force, ultimately absolutely immobilizes the stuff. But it raises lots of questions, doesn't it? You know, what constitutes a barrier in these systems? How many barriers would you actually see? How many do you need? What's their geometry? Does it matter? How much CO2 can you actually contain this way? How do you de-risk all these things, right? So we will use a combination of sand tank modeling, geologic characterization, and reservoir modeling to try to address these things. And we'll experiment. We'll experiment and see what matters, and we'll try to push these systems to failure, much like crash testing cars. You'll learn something about the safety and how to improve them by crashing them into walls. So to start with, this owes everything to Haiwan and her cleverness with sand tank models. But these are 3 sand tank models, 60 centimeters on a side, about 2 centimeters thick. So we can shine light through these things and see both gradations in grain size, but also the behavior of CO2 introduced at the bottom. And you see the experiment. We're experimenting with barriers, right? What constitutes a barrier? What matters in this? So we've got one on the left with short barriers of different sizes. We've got a middle one with longer flat barriers that actually have gradation to them. We thought at the time that graded bedding might help you retain more CO2. So you see the bottom barrier has 1 layer, the middle one has 2 layers, and the top one has 4 layers. And then the last model on the right just shows you effectively very long barriers, right? They go to the sides of the model, but they mimic what in reality would just be very long. They also have some gradation to them. The barriers in this case are medium sand. The background in this is coarse sand. So, you know, in a classic sense, it's all reservoir, right? The gradations between medium sand and coarse sand are just intermediate between coarse and medium sand. We don't have the geologic terms to describe those. They're coarse to medium sand. But look what happens when we put CO2 into these things. So we'll introduce it from the bottom, ambient temperature and pressure, and let it rise as a buoyant fluid. And watch what happens. In particular, watch that middle one. Watch the graded beds, right? It sees the first reduction in permeability and goes, oh, this is hard work. I'm going that way. And it gets diverted, right? I love the, I need Haiwan to tell you the flow rate. Small is the short answer. The model on the left, we run these things until we see CO2 at the top or CO2 analog. The one on the left took about 5 minutes, if I remember right. The one on the right took about 50 hours, again, if I remember right. It's milliliters per minute. So what I take away from this stuff is discontinuous barriers each trap some CO2, right? If you have enough of them, they add up. You could trap a lot. Clearly, barrier length and frequency are important. Long barriers trap more CO2 than short barriers. More barriers, more better, right? Favorable topography helps. it's a nice thing, but of course, at regional scale or project scale, we may not have favorable topography, and it doesn't particularly matter. Likewise, gradation doesn't much matter, nor does capillary entry pressure. It just needs to be a reduction from what's below, right? Any reduction in capillary entry pressure is enough to divert the flow of CO2 at buoyancy pressure. Even the changes from coarse to medium sand or medium to fine sand. So we can also do a whole lot more of these experiments if we do them numerically, right? So Sahar, my numerical modeling genius, put together lots and lots of 2D numerical models that we can experiment with. These things are 10 kilometers long and 100 meters tall, and they really are 2D. They're one grid cell thick. But you see a row of models on the top with net to gross on the left-hand side, porosity in the middle, permeability on the right, and a different row on the bottom, right? Just showing you two different iterations of these things. So the top has a very high net to gross, 80% net to gross, and a relatively long correlation length, CLX, for the barriers, right? So those are 1 kilometer long correlation length, and these are statistically populated. So when I say correlation length, it's the middle of a statistical distribution. The bottom one, 61% net to gross, and a correlation length of 17,000 feet, which is 5K, I think, right? Much longer barriers is the point. And you can see it reflected in the net to gross and the porosity and the permeability. When we put CO2 into these things, look what happens. So the colors are showing you in the middle saturation at the end of injection after 10 years. And then on the right, saturation after 100 years, sorry, 200 years of post-injection, letting the CO2 equilibrate. And even discontinuous barriers in these numerical models behave like the sand tanks. They spread CO2 horizontally, and it really doesn't get very far vertically. And once again, long barriers create a longer plume, longer, lower plume. Short barriers, it gets a little higher, but of course, mostly it just spreads out. Keep in mind, these models are seriously vertically exaggerated, right? That's 100 meters on the vertical, 10 kilometers on the horizontal. So when you see the CO2 plume getting halfway through the model, that's rising 50 meters, not much. This is pressure distribution. So again, hot colors, high pressure, or high pressure buildup. And you can see at the end of injection, we have high pressure around the well, as you'd expect. Post-injection, it spreads out. But in both cases, these barriers are equally effective at attenuating pressure as they are at CO2, which is important because displaced brines in CCS are probably the nastier substance. It's not the CO2 that we worry about so much as the brines. We've run lots of these experiments, in fact, over 100 of them, experimenting with random combinations of variables. So looking at both barrier length and net to gross, but also at capillary entry pressure of the barriers, internal KV/KH of the sand, and one more variable that's escaping me at the moment, but really isn't important. We'll come back to it. What these plots show you are the distribution of different variables, and I'll walk through them, but the distribution of different variables at the end of injection, which is dark blue, and then how they redistribute 200 years later at the end of post-injection. So that's the green. So if we look at CO2 saturation, you can see that at the end of injection, the dark blue, the peak is around 0.35. Post-injection, of course, CO2 spreads out, so the saturation drops, which is why the histogram shifts to the left. Makes sense, right? The next one over is about vertical extent. So how far up in the model does the CO2 rise? And Ly is the height of the CO2 plume. H is the height of the model. So this is showing you fractional height of the model, fractional height of the CO2 plume, percent rise in the model. And what you see, the dark and the green, the dark blue and the green, basically overlie, right? If you look closely, you'll see that the bin width is a little bit different between the green, the post-injection, and the blue, the syn injection. So it's slightly misleading. You are rising a little bit, post-injection, but not very much. It's the take-home message. The bottom left one, lateral extent, there's an obvious shift, right? Post-injection, we've covered, in some cases, almost all of the model, but the peak is around half the model, 0.5, right? Half the model length. End of injection or post-injection, it spreads out, as you'd expect, right? These barriers are promoting lateral flow, and that's what happens. The center of mass, which is the last one, also expressed as a fraction of the height of the model. Again, you can see, and this is height fractional, sorry, center of mass of the plume. So I had this fear, looking at these models with Sahar, that maybe looking at just the top wasn't enough. Looking at the top of the plume wasn't enough. Maybe there was a wholesale redistribution of the CO2 upward in the model, even if the top didn't get much farther. So we started looking at center of mass as well. And you can see it really doesn't change much. There's one outlier point, and the rest of them are pretty much right where the CO2 was at the end of injection. We can do the same thing with pressure, right? So maximum pressure buildup, delta P max. You can see post-injection in blue, it's actually a little bit, it's greater than it is after 200 years, which makes sense, right? Pressure dissipates. Pressure buildup at the top of the model is a whole lot more at, it's not much to start with, right? The biggest peak here is down in the 20 PSI range and tails off quickly, but it reduces fast post-injection. And then the location of max pressure shifts slightly, but not much. So what matters in this, right? We start to get the feeling that these systems work, but what are the important variables? So this is trying to address that, and it's just tornado plots. As you see, the CO2 plume height, so how far up in the model did it rise? The two big levers, net to gross at the top, and correlation length of the barriers, CLX, right? How long are the barriers? Longer is better. In net to gross terms, lower is better. You know, muddier systems. Yeah, Dave, you're looking at me like, yeah, duh. Exactly, it is kind of as expected, right? Capillary entry pressure of the shale is the PCE shale. It does matter a little bit. If you reduce it, of course, you get better performance. Sorry, it's not better performance. It's actually rising a little bit farther in the model. KVKH of the sand didn't matter at all. Capillary entry pressure of the sand really doesn't matter. Center of mass of the plume, you see the same variables. Net to gross, barrier length, and pressure buildup at the top, again, net to gross and barrier length. So we start to get a feel for what matters in this. If I sound like a broken record, it's because there's really two variables that matter. How long are the barriers? How many of them do you have? I started to get a little worried in this that perhaps we were influencing the results by injecting into these systems that were already part confining zone, right? So Sahar made another series of models that have a genuine reservoir below, a good injection zone, where we could pile up a lot of CO2 and then see what it does. So you see the one on the left, are the four different models here with different correlation lengths and different net to gross, right? And you can see the obvious differences between them. There's what happens 1,000 years post-injection. CO2 rises up through the injection zone, which you can see nicely at the bottom, and it spreads out in the confining zone. One of them, the bottom left, actually breaks through. And if I overlay those CO2 saturations on the model, you can start to see why. Right? So the blue in this are the barriers. And that upper left one, the barriers happen to fall in the right place to arrest it, even with a correlation length that's actually 0.3, 30% of the model length, and a net to gross that is 94%, right? 6% barrier. But those barriers happen to fall in the right place. The one on the bottom left, higher net to gross, but the barriers, you know, there happens to be enough holes aligned that CO2 finds a way through, which is interesting. The others, of course, I think the conclusion is probably foregone. But based on lots of these experiments, we can plot net to gross on the horizontal versus CLX over L, so the fractional length of the model of barriers. And you can start to separate models that have CO2 breakthrough from those that don't. So there's a line, right? High net to gross, we need longer correlation lengths. But below about 45% net to gross, it really doesn't matter what the correlation length is. And likewise, even up above 90% net to gross, if we have long correlation lengths, we don't get breakthrough. And the end member on that is effectively a regional seal, right? A correlation length of 1, that is a barrier that spans the whole model, that's a regional seal, right? So even if the net to gross is very high, we know regional seal, fine. All right, so you start to get some comfort with these things. In the end members that we know, all reservoir or lots of reservoir with a regional seal, it behaves as expected. And in between, you start to go, okay, this kind of makes sense. But it raises new questions like, these are models, right? What do real systems look like? Does this actually work? And fortunately, we have a lot of real geology that is really well characterized here in the Gulf of Mexico. So you see here the map of southern Louisiana, red dots on it, and there are 2 clusters, one in southwestern corner and one along the chemical corridor. Those red dots are wells, right? And Yulia did a brilliant job of digitizing the SP logs and interpreting them. So I have, excuse me, sand shale distributions for 300 something SP logs in those 2 clusters, all in deltaic sediments, all without a regional seal. The other thing on the map, the green dots, are producing fields. And these are producing fields with a publication. So these are publications by the regional geological societies that have usually a page of text, a type log, maybe a cross-section, and at least one reservoir map, right? So there's a bit of detail on what's producing and the geology. And I've combed through all of these things. I've recalibrated their stratigraphy based on the published biostrat and made sure that we are looking at deltaic reservoirs that are outside of any regional seal. So based on those things, you can start coming up with statistics for real systems. So shale thickness. Shales, by the way, are clearly a poor proxy for the number of barriers. As I did show you that every permeability reduction constitutes a barrier. I can't count those things on SP logs, unfortunately, but I can count the number of muds, right? The difference between sand and mud is fairly clear. So all of these statistics are based on observable muds on SP logs, which is going to be a gross undercount. It's a conservative view, right? But, conservative is okay, and in science, we'll take what we can get. So shale thicknesses or mud thicknesses, most of these are silty versions of muds. So that's going to be good enough. And you can see thickness, as we know, doesn't really matter. But thickness is some proxy for length. And what we can see on the thicknesses is there's lots of thin ones and a few thick ones, which makes sense, right? It's like everything else in geology. Lots of small ones, a few big ones. We can also count the number per 100 meters. So in those 330 something wells, this is the number of barriers, mud barriers you see per 100 meters. And it ranges from just under 5 up to about 15 with the peak at 7 to 8, right? So this is frequency of barriers. I mentioned that these field reports have a reservoir map, and this is our ace in the hole when it comes to trying to figure out lateral extent of shales, because these reservoir maps have a hydrocarbon water contact on them. So hydrocarbon water contact gives us a minimum lateral extent of the overlying seal, right? It's probably bigger. It'd be an amazing coincidence to have a seal that was an exact cookie cutter shape of the field, but it's possible. So these things give us minimum extents, right? We can measure long axis and short axis, plot them up, and you see long axis gets up to at least 9 kilometers, probably more, but we can't constrain how much more. Short axis gets up to at least 5 kilometers. Again, probably more, but we can't constrain it. The aspect ratios of these are all structurally controlled. Right? So you can see the anticline there. That's one example. What the aspect ratio is, don't really know, but it's at least 2 to 1. That's well and good. But what we really need to put this into a calculation of KVKH is a distribution function for lengths. And this is where it gets a little tricky, because all we have are some observations of maximum length, right? The field observations. So I'll walk you through this, but this is an attempt to bracket ranges for distribution functions. Based on modern deltas and island areas, that is the areas where shales are likely to be preserved, you would say that those follow a log normal distribution. So modern deltas, the island areas, follow a log normal distribution. Lots of barriers in geology. If you look at the statistics from outcrops on shale lengths, they're log normal. Other things in geology follow a power law distribution, like fault lengths, for example. And potentially there's an exponential distribution. My view on this is agnostic. So I put all 3 of those on the plot. There's exponential, there's power law, and there's log normal. But they all follow roughly the same pattern, right? Lots of small things, a few big ones. We can pin the ends of these distributions. Small end, I've made it 1 meter. So 1 meter long shales. Conceptually, we've probably got a lot of those. I've pinned the large end at about 10 kilometers. Right? A little bit bigger than we can observe, which seems safe. But I need one more point in these things to be able to pin it down, because just anchoring the ends, of course, there's a lot of flexibility in the middle. We get that one more point by looking at the field distributions. So in 2 kilometers of section, which is, it's about 1.5 kilometers of section, where these fields are located, we've got 1 documented reservoir interval in most of these reports. That's the map that I made. So that gets you to basically a P1 occurrence for multi-kilometer shales, right? 1 observable, sometimes it's 2, but 1 to 2 documented, mapped multi-kilometer shales in 1.5 kilometers of section, P1. That said, most of these fields produce from 10 to 15 reservoir intervals, some as many as 50, occasionally as few as 5. So 15 in 1,500 meters would be a P10 occurrence, right? They're not mapped in these reports, but they are documented in the reports. So we go 15 reservoir intervals, okay? 15 field-sized seals. The other thing in this is that you'd expect there are probably some other shales of similar size that just don't fall in the right place on the structure to seal an accumulation, right? So P10 occurrence is probably an underestimate, but I have no idea by how much. So the idea here is that P10, I guess I should be saying P90. The 0.9 on this graph ought to be in the range of 1 to 5, even 9 kilometers, right? Somewhere in that range. And that's the way I've bracketed these ranges. So each law, power law, log normal, exponential, has 2 curves with it. One pushes that P90 over toward the 1 kilometer side. The other one pushes it out toward 5 or 6 kilometers, right? We bracket the range. The stars on these curves show you the average length, which is what we're really after. And what you see is that no matter how you draw the curves within that range, we end up with an average that is 1 to 3 kilometers long. It's driven by those few very long shales. So we can put these stats into a calculation of KVKH, effective vertical permeability to horizontal permeability. You can study the numbers in the yellow boxes, but they're taken straight from the statistics I just walked you through, even fairly conservative versions of them. And what you come out with is a mean P50 occurrence of 4/10,000ths effective kVkh, right? This is an incredibly anisotropic system. It's going to be really hard to migrate vertically through this. If anyone has ever tried to produce a reservoir with this kind of kVkh, it's an absolute nightmare, right? Wells on the top don't talk to wells on the bottom. Recovery factor is low until you drill lots and lots and lots of wells and perf them all through the reservoir. It's a pain. P10 occurrence in this is 2/10,000ths. Even P90 is 8/10,000ths. The Monte Carlo distribution on the bottom, 10,000 runs, random combinations of these variables. The peak is down there at 3/10,000ths. Even the tail gets you up to, at the very end of the graph where I can no longer see anything. It's 2/1000ths, right? Really, really low kVkh systems. So you start to see why these things work, right? It's just spreading fluids laterally. We can put this into a full-scale reservoir model, and this is a model 10 kilometers on the side. It's one we built for an actual CO2 sequestration project. For this purpose, we took out any hint of a regional seal. And you can see porosity, permeability, rock type there. The key point is that it's Swiss cheese. No matter how you look at it, it's layers of Swiss cheese. There are holes all through it, right? So we'll inject for 10 years and then watch it for, what was it, 100 years. Sorry, 12 years of injection, 100 years post-injection. And we'll put the well in the sandiest part of the model. So you see the well there, the perforations are in the green interval. Red is coarse sand on this, blue is shale. This is the sandy part of the model, halfway up through it, because the bottom was so shaly that we know what's going to happen. There it is at the end of injection. Big deal, right? 100 years post-injection, migrates up dip a bit, it redistributes a little, but it doesn't get much shallower in the stratigraphy. Mostly it follows the layering. If you look at the CO2 plumes in 3D, they're kind of stacks of pancakes, sort of as you'd expect. Which raises the question, what do you have to do to make these things fail? Right? And we've tried. We've tried pushing that model to failure, and what happens is we lose the CO2 out the side of the model. Every time, we've not been able to get it to fail vertically. But there are risks that I worry about. One of them is aligned holes, right? In this model of Swiss cheese containment, if all the holes happen to line up, you're in trouble. And you're in trouble with traditional regional seals too. These are two examples from offshore Norway. One shows a buried mud volcano. One shows fluid escape pipes. There are a lot of these things in the North Sea as a result of both active hydrocarbon systems, igneous intrusion, and glaciation and dynamic topography and the unloading that goes with it. So you get overpressured, shallow reservoirs that then look for ways to bleed off. But fluid escape pipes are a fantastic way to create aligned holes. That kind of thing I worry about. If you saw this, you'd worry about any seal, any containment, composite or conventional. Another one, of course, is transmissive faults or wells. I didn't put wells on here, but leaky wells serve the same function, right? So there's a couple of examples of transmissive faults, some that I came up with offshore Louisiana and some from offshore Namibia. But you see the amplitude flags along these faults. Little bits of bright amplitude. I've circled the ones in offshore Louisiana that suggest hydrocarbons migrating up the faults, right? Bad news, particularly if you have lots of mobile fluids as you would in a conventional trap. And the other one, which is perhaps more unique to composite confining systems, I worry about high relief traps. The sections here are from Jonathan Osmond's thesis, and they are vertically exaggerated, so it exaggerates the effect, but it makes the point. If you can build a tall column with not very much fluid, then you can start breaching crappy barriers, the silty seals, vertically and efficiently. So rather than getting diverted around the barriers, you can start breaching them. That I worry about, right? And it's the same problem with conventional seals. Tall columns, we get small accumulations. The faults on the right, the very rightmost panel actually does show a gas chimney, a fluid escape pipe coming out of the system. But this point remains whether it's a salt diapir and the steep dips adjacent to it or fault related or whatever. High relief traps. And I can show you a couple examples of both the flaws and the composite confinement in action. So one is Sleipner, which, as some of you will know, is the longest running commercial CCS project in the world. It's an Equinor project in the Norwegian North Sea, sequestering the emissions or the associated CO2 from a high CO2 gas field. Right, so they inject it in the Utsira sand, which you see there on the well logs. It is a beautiful, blocky, clean quartz sand. And as an explorer, I look at that gamma ray log and I see clean, blocky sand. Those of you who are a little more detail-oriented might notice those little spikes on the gamma ray, right? It's not pure high gamma ray. Those are 1 meter thick shales. Not shales, sorry, silts. Crappy barriers, right? And on the 4D, you can see them trapping bits of CO2. Right? There are 9 layers of CO2, each with significant volume. They're behaving like those barriers in the sand tank. However, this being North Sea, there are fluid escape pipes that go through those barriers. And you can actually see them on the 4D when we start to go looking for it. So Williams and Chadwick did a brilliant job of hunting these things down and showing their effect. They're probably about 30 meters wide. I mean, they're giant holes going straight up through the barriers. And they give conduits for the CO2 to go from one barrier up to the next, which it does. The other example is Decatur, which is a project in Illinois to decarbonize the emissions from an ethanol plant. So it's an ADM project. You see the gamma ray log on the left. Greater than 10% porosity is colored red. So deep in the Mount Simon sandstone, you can see a bunch of porosity. That's where they inject. You'll notice there's not a whole lot of porosity in the middle Mount Simon or intervals greater than 10% porosity. It's alternating muds and higher, more cemented sections. And the eagle-eyed among you will see a few little red blips in the upper Mount Simon. The seal, the Eau Claire shale, is at the top of these logs. It's that top interval. That's the prediction, the model of the CO2 plume pre-injection. They're going to inject in the bottom of the Mount Simon and expected it to rise. Right? The Eau Claire seal is at the top of that model. It's the top black line. This is the history match model post-injection. It's spreading out under those barriers. But there is an asterisk. This year, this is a preprint from Bukhar et al. At Imperial College. The log on the well is showing CO2 saturation. And you'll notice there's a bunch of spikes down in the lower Mount Simon, as expected, but there's also a few shallow. And trying to match that, they've come up with this hypothesis that we've got CO2 migrating up an open fault, a transmissive fault. Stay tuned. This is early days, but it illustrates both composite confining system and the potential risks with it, which is the same risk with any seal. So how do you de-risk it? This question comes up all the time. And I answer it the same way. Do the geologic characterization, first and foremost. What have you got to work with? But capture the uncertainty. Are these long barriers? Are they short barriers? We don't know. Bracket that range, capture the uncertainty in the models, and build a range of models that shows that range. Push them to failure. Crash test the cars, right? Find out what it takes to fail these models. So push, if you're planning to inject 50 megatons of CO2 over 30 years, push the models to inject 200 megatons. Find out what happens. Then either acquire more data to fence in the range of uncertainty or dial back the injection scheme, or both, right? So that you have safe operating margins. And finally, set up the monitoring to guard those failure paths that you've identified, right? Pushing the models to failure tells you where they fail, what the risks are. Set up the monitoring to guard that. Right? So pressure monitoring partway through the confining system would be a really valuable way of doing this, right? Perhaps multiple pressure monitors halfway up the confining zone, or pressure monitoring wells that you could monitor at deeper intervals and then back up as you saw the pressure grow. Give yourself time to adjust the operational plans. In context, this is actually a fairly familiar concept. It's an aquitard in groundwater, right? An imperfect barrier that slows flow. Bridget, near and dear to your heart, right? It's migration loss in petroleum, right? This is the fraction that we lose, that we cannot get back, that we just write off. It's been talked about in CCS as secondary and tertiary barriers, but it has much broader application. It starts actually with Reason's, James Reason's Swiss cheese model of accident prevention, published in 1990, if I remember right. The idea that lots of imperfect barriers in series could create really secure accident prevention. And it's been applied to all kinds of things since. COVID containment, of course, we saw it. Cybersecurity, modern warfare, defense in depth, as it's sometimes called in modern warfare, this idea that lots of imperfect barriers can effectively halt an invading army. And I know you look at COVID containment and cybersecurity and go, ooh, those things break all the time. And they do, but they break because people get tired of these barriers. They go, you know, do I really want to wear my mask? Do I really want to socially distance? Do I really want to do this? And they start taking things out. Or they pick up, in cybersecurity, they pick up the USB in the parking lot and they go, ooh, I wonder what's on this, and plug it in, right? Ooh, download that picture. I wonder what it is. These things fail when we bypass the layers. In a geologic system, that's the aligned holes, the fluid escape pipe, right? What we have done with this, what's new in this work, is imagining not just a couple of these barriers, but tens to hundreds of them, right? Over hundreds of meters of section. Most of the studies of these barriers to date have been done on outcrops, which of course limits both the facies you look at, because they have to be cliff-forming facies, nice sands, and they limit the length of what you can observe. So they've come up with distributions, even for marine shales, that range up to a few hundred meters in length. Clearly, there are longer barriers out there. We imagine that these barriers may be kilometer scale on average. And of course, we suggest that this is really good primary containment, not just backup, but primary containment. What I take away from this, composite confining systems are robust under a wide range of scenarios. They're ultra secure. And I say this because the mobile fraction of CO2 or whatever you put into them is small and dispersed. So the column heights are really small, the driving force is small, and the mobile bits are here and there. So even if you had an open wellbore or a leak that opens up, what is there to feed into it? Not much. They are fundamentally different from regional seals because we expect fluids to invade the lower parts of these things. That is part of the confinement. And we care less about the details of individual barriers than we do about the aggregate performance of the system. So you end up going from this very detailed characterization of one layer to a statistical characterization of lots of them. And I sometimes draw the analogy of a homeowner trying to abate the leak from a dripping roof, right? You got a leak in the roof. What do? Classic response is put out a bucket. And that works, right? But you have to make sure the bucket has no holes. You know, the old rusty bucket, you turn it around, look at it under the light, all those things. And you got to keep the kids away from it and the dog, right? If someone kicks it over, forget it. Composite confinement is more like a stack of towels. Got lots of them around. If they're old and ragged, who cares? Pile them up. If the dog knocks them over, kids kick them, whatever. The water doesn't spill. Pile them back up, and you're good to go. So thank you all for listening. Thank you to sponsors of the Gulf Coast Carbon Center, and I am happy to take questions.
All right, we'll first do questions in the room, and then if there is anything over the Zoom, we'll look at that. Anyone with any burning questions?
KH, horizontal vertical permeabilities, were those just calculated for a single borehole, say taking the harmonic versus arithmetic mean of those systems, or was it done somehow?
It's a statistical calculation. So the Monte Carlo distribution and the Monte Carlo distribution that I showed you is a statistical calculation of effective KVKH. The models individually show you how it performs under different circumstances.
So if you wanted to compare that with a single borehole,
Yep.
looking at your thickness, your lenses of various thickness and permeabilities, you can't just take harmonic versus arithmetic means.
It's a little bit different because the mean that I am taking there is the mean barrier length rather than and I think I know where you're coming from with this. If you look at barriers, serial barriers stacked up, the average permeability across them is a geometric mean, right? Yeah, for a 3D system. This is saying that the barriers are sufficient to divert flow. So we're no longer worried about what the barrier permeability is. We're just saying you have to divert around it. So the aggregate, the effective KVKH becomes a question of how far do the fluids have to divert around them. Does that make sense?
Natural.
All right, follow up. It's based on the equations of Begg et al. 1985. It's a well-cited SPE paper. So if you're curious, I'll walk through it with you. I can send you the reference. Anyone online, Begg et al. 1985.
Oh, sure. Oh, hi, Frank. I see that you have a question. Would you like to ask it out loud? I'm also happy to read it for you. Okay, I can.
I'd rather you read it, please.
Oh, sure. Hi, good morning, Frank. Frank's question is, he starts with fantastic models here. I think that there's a really important condition we need to consider. As long as the gas is actively migrating, the local pressure buildup under any barrier should be minimal. Each bubble of gas is effectively at the pressure of the surrounding pore fluid. But as soon as you start to get a static gas accumulation, the pressure will start to build up. And the greater the column height, the worse the pressure, until the seal possibly busts. So maybe it's a big advantage. If there's no really good seal, so you never build up a pressure-connected accumulation? Question mark.
Thank you. I go back to, I completely agree with you. And I go back to, where was it? No, this, with composite confinement, what I really like are low dip scenarios, 2 degrees, 3 degrees. So I know which way the CO2 is going to go in general, but no trap, no closure, no chance to build column height for exactly the reasons that you say. I want to spread it out. So completely agree with you. Ramon?
Yeah, hi, Alex. Thank you. I've always liked this. I mean, I think that your hypothesis here is something that we intuitively kind of felt was right for a long time, but you've sort of crystallized it and tested it, and I really do like that. One thing that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk was that going back a little bit, the whole point of the regulation in the US is protection of groundwater. The UIC class 6 is it's raison d'etre is for protecting groundwater. And you said that in many ways, CO2 getting into a USDW may not be as bad as brine getting into it. So I really like what you've done showing the extent of the plume, the CO2 plume. Is there a way to show what happens to the brine? Because if the brine is the thing that we really are worried about getting into, how much further up above or, is the brine, are we able to see where the brine is versus just the CO2?
So excellent question. The brine, of course, is already there, right? This is the native reservoir brines that are in the Gulf of Mexico, 100,000 parts per million total dissolved solids, sometimes as high as 250 or even 300 parts per million. Really, really salty stuff. Seawater, for reference, is 35,000 parts per million, and we already know you don't want to drink that. Tracking the movement of fluid in a fluid that is already the same is more or less impossible, right? So tracking the displacement of brines is really hard unless you're displacing really salty into less salty. What we can track is pressure, right? Which is the driver for brine movement. So that's the point of these models, looking at pressure buildup and how far that goes. Where there's pressure buildup, we expect brine movement. Where there's no pressure buildup, there's nothing to move the brines. So what this is saying is that the composite system is really effective at limiting the movement of displaced brines as well as CO2. So, good question.
And then we have 7 questions by Sean Brennan. If you'd like to unmute and ask them one by one, please go ahead.
Hey, Alex.
Please don't be
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, sorry. Did you want me to ask, or I can step back? Sorry for all the questions, Alex. It was great. A lot of questions are really not me being nitpicky, me being you making me think. So it's supposed to be a sign of respect. So I hope it's taken that way.
Thank you. I'll take that.
But anyway, if somebody else is going to ask a question, I could wait, or you can we can deal with it a different way. I wasn't sure if somebody was saying something else.
Would you like to just go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. A lot of the questions are just kind of about the model. So I know that with models you have to take a stepwise approach, and you have to go from basic up to more complex. So that's why I was saying these are kind of a great first or several first steps. But I just was wondering what kind of complexity you were able to incorporate into the models. So like how pressure and temperature are dealt with across the model, and how that affects the density and viscosity of all the fluids across the model, or is it kind of kept static across the model? So, and then if the pressure and temperature change, is that going to change the density of the fluid, which may change the volume and may change the capillary entrance pressure that they can attain? So I just don't know how that's dealt with. So that was kind of my first broad set of questions for temperature.
All right.
How's that dealt with?
Well, thank you. Good questions, because the devil with modeling is always the variables you didn't consider, right? And the scenarios you didn't consider. So absolutely fair question. These models are done at realistic depth with both temperature and pressure gradients. So pressure and temperature are not static across the model. They do both increase with depth in a realistic fashion, calibrated for the Gulf of Mexico, and typical injection at, I can't remember what we said, 5,000 feet or 6,000 feet depth, on the order of 2 kilometers. That said, we didn't do a whole lot of experimenting with temperature and pressure. That is, we didn't put ranges in for the Arctic or, other parts of the world. So potentially you could create a different outcome, but I don't think so. Sahar, My, the modeling guru is sitting in the back. Do you want to add anything?
So we have pressure variation in the model, and based on our experience, density varies with pressure more than with temperature. So the model is isothermal, but we can run it at different temperatures. But based on the model, the simulator that we use, we cannot change temperature inside the model. It's just like an isothermal model. But the variation of density with temperature is more than the variation with temperature. And as for salinity, we consider, a constant salinity for the entire model in brine. But to just address Ramon's question as well, so if we want to track, migration of brine, we can consider changes in the salinity in the model. So it can be our future work to be able to track migration of brine with variation in salinity. So this is some complexity that we can add in future model by adding, salinity gradient into the model.
Yeah, good point, actually. We can color the water in a model.
Yeah, so the density is definitely important, but the viscosity, especially not as much in the Gulf, but where you get to some more colder basins, the viscosity difference between the water and the CO2 becomes less. So viscosity becomes more important. I haven't done a sensitivity analysis about how important, but I know viscosity becomes important. So I didn't know if that was factored in. But like I said, not so much for the Gulf, but it's just something to keep in mind as another factor that's going to change across your reservoir as you change temperature and pressure. And the salinity will come into play. Keeping a constant salinity, I think, is perfectly fine. The salinity is not going to change greatly. I think that's a very fair assumption. And all of these assumptions are fair. Like you said, Alex, you have to, it's a stepwise approach to doing more complex models. So that's why I ask questions to try to figure out what's the next step of complexity to add in. And it's something that we, conversations that I have with our modelers all the time too. Like all right, that's great. What's the next step? What's the next step? What's our goal? But how do we get there? So that's just why I bring up some of these things.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move to the next question. We have a prospective doctoral student. Their name is Abdul Basit. And he's asking, can we analog a petroleum producing reservoir similarly in a sandbox and do experiments and numerical modeling to determine the carbon capture and storage capacity of a reservoir?
Yeah, you can. It's the short answer. In some ways, depleted fields are wonderful because you've got lots and lots of data to history match a model and figure out exactly what you could store in them. There's a number of projects in the North Sea that are using depleted fields. The Achilles heel with them tends to be the number of wells. So Gulf of Mexico, nobody is talking about using a depleted field, basically because they are all penetrated by hundreds of old wells, each one of which is a shortcut through the geologic seals and has to be reviewed and potentially remediated, which just adds cost and risk to a project. So yes, you can do it. Do you want to? Maybe not. Sometimes, but good question.
All right, and then we have another question from Tim Good. They're saying, Alex, great talk. Any thoughts on the 2D planform shape, lengths of orthogonal axes of the shales in deltaic systems?
Planform shape and length. What you'd love to do is correlate thickness of shale with length, with area, right? And we can do it with sandstones. But shales, we worry not about the depositional extent so much as the preserved extent, right? Because they get incised by the overlying sands. So correlating thickness with preserved length is just a minefield. And preserved shape really, look at modern deltas, for example, and you see the braided nature, anastomosing nature of river networks in them. Those island areas are probably our best clue to existing shale shapes. They tend to be sort of diamond-shaped, curvy diamonds, but that's about as good as I can do.
We have a question Perhaps a bit on the policy side, a question from Linda McCall is, if and when CO2 barriers are breached, what action is recommended? Aside from, I guess, stopping to inject.
A fair question. The policy imperative and the legal imperative is to safeguard fresh water. So in the US, that is water with less than 10,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. Depth to the base varies hugely from nothing along some coastal areas where it's just brackish water, up to as deep as a kilometer, 2 kilometers, 2.5 kilometers even, outside of San Antonio, for example. So the reason I say that is that your question about if you breach the barriers depends very much on what's on the other side of the barrier. So if we breach a barrier at 3 kilometers and the nearest fresh water is at 500 meters, we look for other barriers. It's the short answer. We very much do set up the monitoring of these projects to guard against this possibility and give us early warning so that we can change the injection strategy. And to be clear, these are well-tested systems. If we as geologists do our homework, do our job well, there is no way CO2 is breaching the barriers. But it is a trust but verify situation, much like arms control. So we do the characterization, we do the modeling, we push the models to failure, but we then set up the monitoring to guard it. And if worst came to worst, your first recourse is stop injection. And if you're really, what happens, we find in lab experiments, is that the CO2 gets buffered very, very quickly. It really doesn't pose much of a threat to the groundwaters, the displaced brines. And if you really had to, you could drill new wells to produce the contaminated brine and re-inject it deeper somewhere else.
So we have more questions and we're approaching time, so I will take one more question, but then the remaining people, please feel free to reach out to Alex by email and continue asking. The last question of this session is from Mark Adamski. They say, thanks for the presentation. In the presentation, you said you worry about or don't like steep dips for traps. Any feel for what you consider a steep dip to be?
It's a good question. It's not something that we've actively experimented with. So, in this context, greater than 10 degrees, it's really a question, and I put that out as a kind of spitball answer. It's really a question of how much CO2 do you inject versus the dip and the column height you could build, right? So small amounts of CO2, fine, you could use 30-degree dips and probably build a very small column height. It's just about that concentration and the column height you build. So spitball answer, anything less than 10 degrees, you're probably fine. But it's a fair question, something to experiment with and to de-risk.
All right, and with that, we're at time. Thank you everyone for your attendance. And please feel free to reach out to Alex with more questions.
Thank you all for coming.